It all started on a quiet Thursday afternoon when I pulled into the gravel driveway of my mountain cabin, only to notice something that immediately made my blood run cold. Tucked neatly into the ground, right at the entrance of my property, was a glossy real estate sign. It had my street address printed across the top in bold lettering, and beneath it was a smiling face of a realtor I had never even met. According to that sign, my cabin was for sale. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe the realtor's office had mixed up the address, or maybe someone had accidentally installed a sign on the wrong property. But as I walked up to my front gate, I realized this wasn't just an innocent accident. Hanging on the gate was a laminated notice, stamped with the seal of my homeowners association. The notice stated that the cabin was being prepared for resale and that the HOA had authorized a tour for potential buyers. My cabin was not for sale. It had never been for sale. And yet, the HOA had unilaterally decided to treat my property as if they owned it. I stood there stunned, staring at the bold arrogance of that notice. The cabin wasn't just a weekend getaway for me. It had been my sanctuary for years, a retreat I had built with my own hands, piece by piece. Every log, every nail, every memory belonged to me. But the HOA, in their constant hunger for control, seemed to think they had the right to treat my home like one of their community-owned assets. I began digging deeper. A quick call to the realtor's office confirmed my suspicions. The HOA president had contacted her personally, claiming my cabin was going on the market. According to the realtor, the HOA had told her I was eager to sell quickly and that they were acting as my point of contact. The realtor had no reason to doubt them. After all, HOA boards are usually seen as authoritative voices in their neighborhoods. But in this case, they were nothing more than liars. Anger simmered inside me, but I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing me panic. Instead, I decided to fight back quietly, methodically, and on my own terms. The first thing I did was lock the front gate with a heavy-duty chain and padlock. If they wanted to parade strangers to my cabin, they were going to have to explain why the so-called for sale property was barricaded shut. Then I went one step further. Right beneath their pristine real estate sign, I hammered in my own hand-painted board. In bold black letters it read, "Private property, not for sale. Trespassers will be reported." It was the perfect counterpunch. I knew the realtor would drive by eventually to check the listing, and when she saw my sign nailed directly under hers, she'd realize something was very wrong. Of course, the HOA wasn't going to let this go quietly. Within 48 hours, I received a barrage of emails from the board demanding that I cooperate with the realtor and honor the process. They claimed that because the cabin was located in an HOA-managed community, they had the authority to facilitate property transactions on behalf of owners. To them, my act of locking the gate and putting up my own sign was a form of non-compliance. But I wasn't budging. If anything, their desperation only fueled my determination to hold my ground. I knew this wasn't about selling my property. It was about control. The HOA wanted to send a message that they, not the homeowners, held ultimate power. Little did they know, I was ready to send a much louder message back. As I stood by the gate, staring at the clash of signs, one glossy and professional, the other raw and defiant, I realized this was only the beginning. The HOA had crossed a line, and in doing so, they had awakened a fight they weren't prepared for. Because if they wanted a war over my cabin, then I was more than ready to give them one. The following week, the situation escalated in a way that felt almost surreal. It was clear the HOA had no intention of backing down. Instead, they doubled down on their efforts, determined to make me bend to their so-called authority. It began when I noticed cars slowly cruising by my driveway. Not just one or two, but several over the course of a single afternoon. Strangers in shiny SUVs and sedans, peering out their windows, squinting to get a look at the cabin tucked behind the trees. One even stopped long enough to roll down their window and snap a few photos before speeding off. That's when it hit me. The HOA had gone ahead and listed my property online. They had posted professional photos of my cabin, pictures I had never taken, which meant they had either broken in or dug up old images from somewhere. On the listing, the description painted a rosy picture about charming mountain views, ideal location, and motivated seller. Motivated seller. I almost laughed at the audacity. The fury boiling inside me was matched only by disbelief. This wasn't just an overstep. It was fraud. But when I confronted the realtor over phone, she seemed just as trapped as I was. She admitted the HOA had given her all the information, even access to community files, which they claimed was proof of their authority. She apologized profusely, but insisted she couldn't simply pull the listing until the HOA clarified their position. The board was playing a dangerous game, and so I decided to raise the stakes. If they wanted to advertise my home as a prize for strangers to gawk at, I was going to make sure those strangers got the real story. I printed a stack of flyers and posted them around the neighborhood. This property is not for sale. The HOA has acted without consent. Entering this cabin is trespassing. I stapled them to mailboxes, pinned them on community bulletin boards, and slid them under the doors of neighbors who I knew had their doubts about the HOA's antics. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was pulling back the curtain on their schemes. The fallout was immediate. I started receiving messages from neighbors who were furious on my behalf. Some admitted they had grown tired of the HOA's heavy-handed tactics, but had been too afraid to speak out. My cabin situation had become the spark that lit a larger fire. Suddenly, people were talking, and the HOA hated that. 2 days later, I received a formal notice of violation. They accused me of defacing community signage with my personal sign and spreading misinformation through my flyers. They threatened daily fines until I complied with their orders. But here's the thing. The fines meant nothing because their power only extended so far. Without my consent, they couldn't force a sale. Without my signature, they couldn't transfer a deed. They could bluff, threaten, and intimidate, but legally, their hands were tied. Still, they weren't giving up. That weekend, I caught them trying to host a scheduled open house. Imagine their embarrassment when the realtor and her client arrived at my gate, only to find it locked tight, with my warning signs glaring back at them. The clients drove away confused. The realtor looked shaken, and the HOA president? She stood there fuming, her face red with rage as she barked orders into her phone. That was the moment I knew I had turned the tables. They weren't in control anymore. I was, and the more they pushed, the more desperate they looked. But I also knew this wasn't over. The HOA president was not the kind of person to accept defeat gracefully. If she couldn't bully me into submission, she was going to try something else. Something bigger. And sure enough, her next move was already in motion, one that would drag lawyers, town officials, and the entire community into the fight. The HOA president's final move came swiftly, and it was as aggressive as I had expected. Within a week, I received a thick envelope in the mail, a formal legal notice. Inside was a letter drafted by the HOA's attorney, claiming that under community bylaws, the board had the authority to act as an intermediary in real estate matters. According to them, my refusal to cooperate was a breach of contract, and they were preparing to pursue legal remedies. To most homeowners, that kind of language would have been terrifying. And that was exactly the point. The HOA thrived on intimidation, but I wasn't about to roll over. I knew my rights, and I knew that what they were doing wasn't just unethical, it was unlawful. So I reached out to my own attorney. Within days, we drafted a response that cut through their smoke and mirrors. My lawyer pointed out in clear terms that the HOA had no ownership interest in my property, no contractual authority to represent me in a sale, and no right to trespass or distribute fraudulent listings. If they continued their charade, they would be facing charges of fraud, defamation, and interference with private property. But I didn't stop there. Along with my lawyer's letter, I compiled a thick file of evidence. Photos of their unauthorized sign, screenshots of the fraudulent listing, copies of the violation notices, and even testimony from neighbors who had seen their open house debacle firsthand. Then I took the file straight to the county office and lodged a formal complaint. That move changed everything. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't just fighting me. They were on the radar of county officials who had the power to investigate their conduct. Within weeks, the board was notified that their actions were under review and that their misuse of authority could lead to fines or even removal. The effect rippled through the neighborhood. Homeowners who had once kept quiet started to voice their frustrations more openly. At the next community meeting, residents stood up and demanded answers from the HOA president. Why had she tried to sell a property she didn't own? Why had she lied to a realtor? Why had she risked dragging the entire neighborhood into a legal battle out of pure arrogance? The pressure mounted, and soon enough, cracks appeared in her armor. Board members who had once backed her out of loyalty or fear began to distance themselves. Nobody wanted to be tied to a scandal that could bring down the entire HOA. Finally, after weeks of silence, the fraudulent listing was pulled offline. The glossy sign disappeared from my driveway, and with little fanfare, the HOA president submitted her resignation. Officially, she claimed it was for personal reasons, but everyone in the community knew the truth. She had been beaten. For me, the victory wasn't just about protecting my cabin. It was about sending a message. The HOA had tried to strip away my rights, to claim authority they never had, and to profit from lies. And in the end, all their scheming had backfired spectacularly. When I stood once again at my gate, looking up at my cabin nestled against the mountains, I felt something deeper than relief. I felt pride, not just because I had won, but because I hadn't let fear dictate my choices. The HOA wanted obedience. Instead, they got resistance. The cabin remained mine, unshaken and untouchable, just as it had always been. And as for the HOA, their reputation never fully recovered. The story of what they tried to pull on me became a cautionary tale whispered through the neighborhood, a reminder that sometimes the only way to deal with bullies in positions of power is to stand your ground and fight back. In the end, the cabin was never for sale, but what I gained was far more valuable. Freedom from their control, and the knowledge that no one, not even a power-hungry HOA, could take away what was mine.